Alright, let's watch this. We got a not just bikes video.
The Netherlands is a great place if you don't want to drive.
Yeah.
There are lots of areas that are pedestrianized and nearly car-free. Trains are so pervasive and frequent that they work almost like a countrywide metro system. Plus, rail stations have giant bicycle parking garages and high-quality public transit connections to get you to your final destination. And there are bicycle paths almost everywhere. In many cases, cyclists can take the fastest and most direct route to where they're going, while drivers need to take the long way around. I get a lot of comments on this channel by people who say that they love cars and would hate to live somewhere like this. But what they don't realize is that driving is awesome in the Netherlands. This summer, I traveled to Canada to visit family, and I did a lot of driving while I was there. After almost 2 years away, it was a real shock to go from the comfortable, civilized driving experience in the Netherlands to driving in Canada. It made me appreciate how good we have it here. I'm not the only one who thinks this either. Take for example the YouTube channel Curleem, an American and self-professed car guy who lives in Amsterdam and has made several videos about how much he prefers driving in the Netherlands compared to places like Toronto or his home state of Florida. And yet Florida is a state that is infamous for how car-centric it is and how hostile it is for pedestrians and cyclists. It should be a great place to drive, but it's not. Further proof is available from Waze, who used to collect data from their platform to determine a driver satisfaction index each year. And they determined that the Netherlands was the best country in the world to be a driver. This doesn't surprise me at all. Driving in the Netherlands is so pleasant. The infrastructure is of high quality and it's in great condition. And in general, traffic is pretty light and flows pretty smoothly. Sure, there's traffic in rush hour, but rush hour is still about an hour. It's not a near constant traffic jam spread throughout the day like in most US and Canadian cities. It's more like a traffic hagelslag, lightly sprinkled over the week. And there are clever approaches to temporary traffic conditions on the highway, such as these rush hour lanes that open when necessary, and changing speed limits based on congestion because drivers traveling slower have less space between cars and make better use of the road space. It blows my mind that driving out of town on a long weekend doesn't involve getting stuck in soul-crushing traffic, like it does in almost every other city I've lived in. You'll see lots of caravans and bicycles attached to cars, but otherwise, it's hardly any different than a regular day. I've lived in cities that have a quarter the population of Amsterdam, yet traffic in them is considerably worse. This all comes down to the fundamental truth. There's no solution to traffic congestion except viable alternatives to driving, and most Dutch cities have viable alternatives to driving for many trips, which reduces the number of cars on the road. In many Dutch cities, taking a bicycle is often the fastest way to get somewhere, because cyclists can usually take the shortest and most direct route, while drivers need to take the long way around. You might think that this is bad for drivers, but it's not, because if cycling wasn't faster, many of these people would be in cars, and the streets would be so clogged with traffic that the direct route would be even slower than the indirect route is today. In fact, this was the case in Amsterdam in the 1970s. It may seem counterintuitive, but designing to prioritize walking, cycling, and public transit actually works out better for drivers.
Dirty Deets, thank you for resubscribing. 2 months in a row, thank you so much. We got a naturally occurring Zebby in the wild. That's a Puggers, thank you.
And, unsurprisingly, the Dutch cities that are the most car-centric also have the worst traffic. One of the things that makes driving here particularly pleasant is the fact that the traffic lights are smarter, so you end up waiting a lot less. I made a video about traffic lights from the point of view of cyclists and pedestrians, but they work better for drivers too. Almost every traffic light in the Netherlands has multiple detection loops. One at the stop line, like in many other countries, but also at least one farther back.
So basically thus far, we are learning that in the Netherlands, there's a lot of money that is put into public infrastructure that includes roadways, that includes technologies that are used to help streamline our roads and traffic, or streamline technology rather, is used to help keep uh, automobiles moving to work as part of a greater multimodal transportation system. And that's probably a lot easier to achieve whenever not so many people rely on cars to get from point A to point B. So when you have a mix of people who are using other means of transportation, or other modes of transportation rather, like public transit, like a light rail, like the bike lanes, like pedestrian walkways even, there's not as much of a need to use the roads intended to be utilized only by automobiles like we have here in the United States. Also, I would be interested to see how the design of exurbs in Dutch cities vary or are different compared to our suburbs and our exurbs that are usually right off of a major highway or a freeway. And that is to help get people from the suburban areas where they live to the main highway, bringing you into a city, into the urban core where you most likely work. And so, because a lot of people are frequenting and using these major highways, that even though they have like 7 lanes of traffic, you still find yourself waiting in, rush hour for hours, either coming in or leaving a city, depending on the time of day. And that's because, it's the main vein, so to speak, that gets you to your next destination. Meaning, like, I can't even use like LA roads because I'm honestly not too familiar, but in Albuquerque, for example, you have Highway 40, you have Interstate 40 and I-25 that run like literally through Albuquerque, right? So, depending on the time of day, you have I-25 that can come to like a dead stop. And it's because everyone relies on I-25 to get to their exit that eventually connects them to their suburban enclave where they live. And you might have some gridlocked roadways that you can take instead of the major highway if it's rush hour. But ultimately, because that is the main arterial road or the main vein that is connecting to those smaller arterial roadways, everyone is on that major connector or major freeway getting onto that major highway. And if that is what is connecting all roads, so to speak, then everyone's going to be using that main line to get to their next road that eventually leads them to, their boulevard, that leads them to their end street, and then their garage. And that design isn't necessarily different in the Netherlands, I would presume. It's just that there's probably a larger network of public transportation that has the capacity to reach some of these suburban neighborhoods, or what would be the closest thing to a suburban neighborhood, that allows more people to use public transportation and have access to public transportation in their residential areas. And that is not really the case in our suburban enclaves, not a lot of bus stops or transit stops in the suburbs. Why? Who would most likely benefit from public transportation? Those who are considered lower income residents. Do lower income residents live in the gated communities in the suburbs? No. Homeowners work very hard to make sure that there is no diversity of housing stock in those gated communities. There are no multifamily housing available or built in those areas. And so suburban housewives drive fucking Range Rovers. There's no need to even have a bus line go that far. You know what I mean? So, because that tends to be the case, the further out that you go, the more reliable you are on a car to get you from point A to point B, the more congested the roadways are going to be because there's no public alternative in the form of transit that you can take in lieu of the highway using a vehicle. But again, I'm not so sure how the design of residential spaces have unfolded in the Netherlands. Also, riding a bike in Florida is a nightmare. Honestly, that heat is kind of insane. True. Mhm.
This junction has 3 of them. This allows the traffic control system to intelligently schedule the stoplights based on the traffic detected from each direction. For example, you will very often see the traffic light turn red just as the last car passes the stop line. This is because the control system uses the farther detection loop to determine that there isn't another car approaching, so it's safe to change the light to red early and let another direction go while there's a gap in traffic. It also works to turn a light green early if it detects your car or bike is approaching when it's safe to stop traffic in other directions. Another difference is that, in the US and Canada, traffic lights are stupid and go all green in one direction followed by all green in the other direction. But here in the Netherlands, traffic lights work in multiple phases, so there are many different combinations possible for things like dedicated right turns and left.
It looks like they have more than just like a 4-way intersection too. Like this almost looks like It looks like an 8-way intersection that you see at a roundabout.
Left turns simultaneously. This not only speeds up waiting times at traffic lights, it also makes turning much less dangerous and stressful because when you have a green arrow, you're almost always clear to turn.
Uncommon Man, thank you for subscribing
the
to
left turn across traffic on a stroke
another naturally occurring sub in the wild. Thank you.
Is one of the most dangerous and stressful driving maneuvers in the United States and Canada. I almost never need to perform a turn like this in the Netherlands. Speaking of stroads, there are almost none in the Netherlands, as I've talked about in previous videos.
No stroads? Okay, so that's a major difference in the design of neighborhoods in Netherlands.
This means that when you're on a road, there are very few side streets, driveways, or crossings to slow you down. This has so many benefits that it's hard to list them all. In general, the lack of stroads keeps traffic moving smoothly, and even if the speed limit is lower, your average speed is much higher because there are fewer cars merging in and out, and fewer traffic lights. This is something that people don't appreciate enough. Stroads have so many driveways and side streets that require merging into high-speed traffic that some driveways inevitably get traffic buildups from people trying to exit. The solution is to install a traffic light, which is why there are so many traffic lights in most North American cities. In the newest Strong Towns book, Confessions of a Recovering Engineer, author Chuck Marohn measured his average speed at rush hour and found that it was about 16 kilometers per hour. Actually, it was an average of less than 10 miles per hour, but I'm converting everything to metric here because imperial units are stupid. So, despite the roads having a speed limit of 50 kilometers per hour or more, his average speed was less than 16 because of all the traffic lights. And this was in a tiny town of only 14,000 people. Incidentally, 16 kilometers an hour is the average speed of a cyclist in Amsterdam, because bicycle routes are designed to avoid traffic lights and to keep cyclists moving. This really shows you how backwards American traffic engineering is when the average speed of a car in a small town in the US is the same as a bicycle in the largest and busiest city in the Netherlands. I had the same experience when driving in my hometown this summer. I was constantly sitting at red lights when I was driving simply because there are so many of them. And if
Just imagine if you had the same. Okay, like, and this is going to come across as probably a little insensitive, so I'm going to try to watch how I unpack this. In the United States, we have had a team of advertisers and market specialists convince people to take great pride in the car that you drive. It has a lot to do with how we are a culture of consumers, and we convince people by way of marketing and advertisements that you need to buy something. It is part of your identity. It is how you have, you take pride in what you have, in the appearance of such. What if the same amount of influence and energy to convince somebody to have or take pride in your appearance were placed more so in your physical appearance in order to try to get people on board with biking instead of having a car to get from point A to point B, right? Because our health is our wealth. But think about how the culture of cars is so incredibly important to so many people. And unfortunately, because the way that our cities and our communities are designed, it can be almost be an issue of feasibility as to whether or not you can safely get from point A to point B by way of bicycle. But you have a car lobby on top of people who identify their personality or part or components of their personality based on the car that they drive. They take appearance in their car. Think about how they wash it, they dry it, they take really good care of it. And as you should, if that's your investment. I mean, I'm not saying to treat your car like a piece of shit, but so many people think about car ownership as almost not the epitome, so to speak, but a highly, incredibly important or a critical component of American independence. That having your car allows you the freedom to go wherever you do so choose. And that has been like burned into our brain. And think about how backwards it is to feel so committed or devoted to car ownership. I mean, we rely on cars in part because there's no other mode of transportation that is available to allow us to get to work or to use it in our destination to the next place we're trying to get or we need to be, right? So our travel is almost limited to cars only because of the way that our cities and our suburban areas were designed. And that's not necessarily the fault of, a city dweller or somebody who can't afford to live in an area that is a little bit more walkable or has better modes of transportation that allows you to take part of that process of opting to use public transit instead of your car, because that comes with a price. The more expensive an area is, especially in an urban area that's gone through the process of urbanizing, the more expensive it is going to be for the individual either buying or renting in a city. But I'm just saying, if we had the funding available to retrofit our cities and build walkable cities, new infrastructure, multimodal transportation systems, think about how necessary it would be to try to combat the car lobby, conservatives, the what was it? There was an episode of PragerU talking about how liberals want to take our cars away. Well, kind of, sometimes. Think about how they're already fighting back. They're already preparing for a culture war. About how the liberals want to take away your guns and your cars. And how it's almost necessary to start thinking about how you can combat conservative rhetoric and conservative narratives in favor of the car. To try to convince people that actually ditching your car will not only be beneficial to the environment, reducing your carbon footprint, but it also helps your body, your physique. It helps you stay in shape. Take pride in your appearance more than your car. And that will also help you mentally in the long run. But no, not here in this country. Big gulps, all right? Big gulps, and don't try to put a tax on it. Here in America. Sorry, I'm dead horsey dead. I'm ranting.
There aren't traffic lights, there are stop signs.
I just think about how the political messaging, when it comes to something that should be so fucking clear, that we need to try to reduce car ownership and reduce our car-centric design and built environments around the automobile. That should be a no-brainer, but I understand that some people don't want to see change. They like where they live. They don't mind that they travel an hour to and from work in their car. They like the freedom that offers. And they're able to look past the points of depression or maybe the mental health ailments that they are suffering due to very long commutes because they have a car or a truck that they really like that is very nice. And that makes it feel worth it. You know what I mean? I feel like the cultural messaging has muddied the waters of public transit. Yeah, a lot of people think that public transit is gross, and people who utilize public transit are also gross. It's become classist, so to speak. And why? Who tends to have access to and can afford cars? Also the people who can afford to live in high-priced homes in the suburbs. Not an accident.
So many stop signs. Instead of designing proper traffic calming, North American traffic engineers just put stop signs everywhere to slow down drivers. I already made a previous video about why I hate stop signs and why they shouldn't be required at all, especially for cyclists. But yeah, it's so nice to drive through the Netherlands and not see any stop signs at all. And the very, very, very few times you see one, it's actually necessary. Of course, there are many intersections with roundabouts too, which is even better.
Okay, so one of the reasons why this is the case, and this is pretty unique to American communities. Jazz Mattis, thank you for the 1,000 biddies. Thank you. It's because cars are almost, in some cases, boulevards, specifically like boulevards where you have like 2 lanes of traffic going in either direction, separated by a median, sometimes a tree-lined parkway that is there to like capture rainwater runoff. Those types of roads in particular that lead to like the side streets that then lead to your garage, right? Those roads or those boulevards, they are stroads connecting to those smaller lanes, 2-lane roads that eventually lead to your either your subdivision or your house, right? And in America, there is no other or in most cases, it's not always, but here in America, those roads, those boulevards, or those stroads that have a lot of those intersecting roadways connecting to actual neighborhoods or homes or, you know, subdevelopments, they're not shared with other modes of transportation. There's not always a bike lane. There's not always a dedicated bus lane. There's not always a sidewalk. Because it is a connector road that is usually moving pretty quickly, except whenever you have multiple stops or you have multiple intersections that start to slow down the traffic once you start to get to developed area for residential spaces. And it's only cars. No buses. No bikes. No people. So that's the reason why you have so many stop signs in these areas that abruptly shift in traffic patterns, because Americans are fucking assholes and they are experiencing changes in the roadways where they are the only people on the road to all of a sudden entering like maybe a shared space where they're starting to interface with a bike lane or an existing bus lane, and then those traffic patterns change and they have to be made aware of those changes from signage. That includes a stop sign. That includes notice that there is a bike lane or a bus lane that begins. Because unlike in other places, a lot of American roads are solely dedicated to the automobile. And that requires an immense amount of signage to make the drivers aware. And you've seen the way that drivers act when they have to start sharing the road with bicyclists. Particularly bicyclists. Cyclists. And they don't necessarily like it because they're spoiled in many respects. Because they're so used to the road just being theirs that when it comes to having to share it, they start to get a little pissy about it. Now I'm getting off topic, but that is the reason why, in America, those signs are actually quite necessary. If we didn't have them, a lot more fatalities would happen. A lot more near misses and a lot more traffic collisions would occur and a lot more people would be dead. Nobody's going to want to go out with somebody, though, they don't have a car. Alright, Thomas Bullock, just keep on going on to farmersonly.com. Like, where do you live? On a fucking farm? If you're in a city, nobody's going to give a shit if you have a car. Like, what do you mean? What year is it? What are you talking about? I'm sorry, I don't mean to go so hard, but that's not true at all. You don't need a car in order to date. In the year 2021? I mean, obviously, if you're like in a rural or a suburban area, it's a little different. But I don't know. Having a car does help. It's not absolutely necessary though. If you're on a farm, take a tractor. Yeah, just get a fucking radio flyer, tie it to the back of a bicycle, and boom. Also, I hate this. I hate that I'm about to say this. Depending on where you live. If you can buy a car relatively cheap, if you aren't picky, I think that I hate that this kind of helps, this can help like fucks like Elon Musk, but depending on the city, depending on the walkability, how close you are to things that you need, resources, sometimes it is cheaper to use Uber, even if you're using Uber all the time. If you don't have to use a car to get to work, if you don't have to use a car to go to the grocery store, if you don't need a car to do your daily tasks, if you live in an area that is walkable and has everything that you need nearby, researchers say that it is more cost beneficial to you to sell your car and Uber when you need it. Which kind of handles the I don't have a car problem. Now you get to make out in the back of a car on your way home if you're dating.
and there's almost no waiting at all and traffic flows even more efficiently. Though roundabouts can get backed up if there's too much car traffic, so they don't work everywhere. Of course, the Dutch have a solution for that too, which is turbo roundabouts, but they deserve their own video someday. I would gladly take a road with a lower maximum speed limit if that road design means that I achieve a higher average speed, and that is exactly what I experience driving in the Netherlands. I made a video about speed limits recently, but what's relevant here is that speed limits in the Netherlands mostly make sense. Different streets with different speed limits are designed differently, so you rarely need to check your speed. The speed that feels right on a given street is usually the correct one. When I was driving in my hometown this summer, I was constantly needing to check what the speed limit was, because everything is designed like a giant strode, yet the speed limit could be anywhere from 40 kilometers an hour to 80 kilometers an hour with no difference in road design. Another factor that makes driving in the Netherlands less stressful is that the drivers themselves are better. There are many aspects of this, such as stricter licensing requirements, but I believe the single most important factor is that, in most Dutch cities, there are viable alternatives to driving. This means that the only people who are driving are those people who want to drive or those people who need to drive. Most people who live in a Dutch city can make many trips by walking, cycling, or public transit. Even if somebody drives to work, they may still get their grocery shopping by bicycle, walk to a doctor's appointment, or take public transportation to a football game. In particular, shopping by bicycle or by walking is a very low-stress activity, and it's usually done when you're on the way home from somewhere else, so it doesn't even feel like a chore. In car-dependent places, you need to drive for everything, so even the most trivial of errands like buying a bag of milk feels like a trip. Not only does this result in a huge amount of excess cars on the road, contributing to more traffic, it also just sucks to do. It sucks to have to get in your car and drive in traffic to do normal everyday tasks like going to an appointment or feeding your family. Some people may like cars, but driving in this traffic is not fun. So when you get a whole city of people who are forced to do something that sucks every single day, you get a lot of pissed off people on the road. That's not to say that there are no assholes on the road here in the Netherlands. I mean, they sell a lot of Audis here too. But there simply isn't the same level of angry, distracted, or bored drivers that you have to contend with in a car-dependent city. This contributes so much to making the driving experience more pleasant here. And this is even more noticeable when walking or cycling because you're not dealing with hyper-aggressive impatient jerks every time you encounter a car. Of course, it also helps that conflicts between drivers and cyclists are kept to a minimum in the Netherlands, either with protected bicycle paths or by providing totally separate routes for bicycles. This also makes it less stressful to drive because, despite there being so many cyclists in the Netherlands, I find it much easier to avoid people on bicycles when I'm driving. Most people want to avoid hitting pedestrians and cyclists unless you're a pickup driver in Houston or something, so having
like, depending on where you are, again, sometimes it can be a hassle if you know that regardless of the time, the mileage, like the VMT, the vehicle miles traveled, you're going to spend a considerable amount not moving while in transit to get to your final destination or whatever your stop is. And so that can be a real daunting thing that you probably aren't looking forward to. So say on your way to work, if you know that you are going to spend at least 10 to 15 minutes in rush hour traffic, standing still, not going nowhere. That's gotta be, that has to be contributing in some part to the higher levels of anxiety and depression that people tend to have if they are experiencing hour-long commutes or more. If a metro isn't kind of stinky and kind of icky, are people even using it? At least it's going to good use. That's all I'm saying.
Fewer points of conflict with people outside of cars makes driving easier. Another thing that makes driving great in the Netherlands is that the road infrastructure is of extremely high quality and it's exquisitely maintained.
Ooh.
Seriously, I've been living in the Netherlands for 3 years now, and this is the only bad pothole I've ever seen. It was so notable that I went home to get my camera to film it. This blows my mind. There's a lot of myths about where potholes come from, but when you boil it all down, they're caused by two things: lots of heavy vehicles and insufficient maintenance. The formation of potholes can be sped up a lot by freeze-thaw cycles, but this only happens if water is allowed to enter cracks in the asphalt or if there is poor drainage of the road. If cracks are filled promptly and water is not allowed to penetrate, then potholes are much less likely to form. Look at any list online of the worst roads in America and you'll see sunny places like Honolulu, Los Angeles, and Baton Rouge right alongside New York, Cleveland, and Philadelphia. The fact is, when your city is built only for cars and trucks, you're going to have a lot more car and truck traffic. And as Strong Towns has taught us, if your city is made up of sprawling car-dependent infrastructure, then it's not capable of financially sustaining itself. This is ultimately the real reason why the roads are in such poor condition in many other cities. There's just too much asphalt and stormwater management infrastructure per person to properly maintain it all. This leads to the sad irony. Designing your city only for cars makes the roads worse for drivers. And then there's the issue of tax. Drivers simply do not pay the full cost of the roads, period. This is especially true in the United States, where the federal gas tax has been the same since 1993 at 18.4 cents per gallon, while the number of miles of asphalt and construction costs have skyrocketed. But that's a larger topic that deserves its own video someday. And finally, driving in the Netherlands just looks nicer too. You wouldn't think it makes a big difference, but it does. It's so much nicer.
So chat, you know when I talk about boulevards, this isn't necessarily a boulevard yet. Maybe it expands into 2 lanes of traffic, but right now it looks like it's 1. But you see in the middle right here, this median, the green space, this serves a very specific purpose that I've said once already, and I say usually like every other day. This is to capture rainwater. This is to help collect runoff from rainwater. It is a flood mitigation strategy that can be a lot cheaper than any formal infrastructure that requires like actual tubes and diversion channels. You can literally just collect the rainwater right here to the roots of trees. And I would say that it's a tried and true. It's a tried and true strategy. Super reassuring for crossing also.
To drive along a road like this than a strode like this. This is like the origin of the parkway concept. Just as people like taking walks in parks, mid-century traffic engineers thought that people would enjoy going on drives along parkways. So many
That was like part of the City Beautiful. That was actually part of like the City Beautiful paradigm shift too.
Parkways were created in the US and Canada as a place for leisure driving. Of course, due to induced demand, those parkways became more like parking lots. Trust me, I did not enjoy taking the Don Valley Parkway to work every day. I don't particularly like cars, and I treat them like any other kind of tool. Car enthusiasts are really bizarre to me because it's like being a power saw enthusiast. I mean, yeah, they're pretty cool, but I really don't care about them unless I need to cut some wood. Now, power washers, on the other hand, are something I could get into. So if the Netherlands can make someone like me appreciate driving, then it's really impressive. Though I must admit that my favorite part of driving in the Netherlands is when I park the car and get back on my bike. Because what's even better than driving in the Netherlands is cycling here. I'd like to thank my supporters on Patreon who pay me to extol my love of driving. If you'd like to support the channel and get access to bonus videos, visit patreon.com/notjust.
Yeah, I think so. Why I hate Houston. I'm assuming that the Not Just Bikes guy hates Houston because there's no zoning code, right? There's no zoning laws that are determining land use. They have like covenants. But that's the reason why a lot of people in this profession, or who consider themselves enthusiasts of sorts within the field or the realm of city planning, hate Houston.